She whispered, "You're not my family anymore," and asked me not to join the family photo. 2 hours later, she was crying in front of 200 guests while her new in-laws turned their backs. What changed? Just one decision. A story about sacrifice, betrayal, and the ultimate lesson in self-respect. The envelope in my pocket held $25,000, every penny I'd saved from my pension. 6 months of overtime shifts, skipped meals, and canceled plans just to make my daughter's wedding perfect. Not extravagant, perfect. Something she could be proud of, something that made her feel loved. Tables were set with gold-trimmed china. The ceiling alone had more decorative molding than my entire house. All of it paid for with the envelope in my jacket. And then, through the crowd, I saw her. Georgiana. My little girl. Except she wasn't little anymore. She stood near the main archway in a wedding dress that shimmered like frost under the light. Silk, lace, and God knows what. Her hair was swept into some fancy updo. Her smile was dazzling. For a second, I forgot everything. I just saw her, my daughter. Then she looked at me. "Oh," she said like I'd interrupted a thought. "You actually came. No hug, no warmth. Just a quick glance and a surprised smile that didn't reach her eyes." Before I could answer, she turned. "Norman, Eleanor, come meet my father," she said, her voice suddenly filled with sweetness. "My real family." Those last words sliced. Norman Whitaker, tall and silver-haired, strode toward us with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. His navy suit probably cost more than my monthly pension. Eleanor followed, dripping in pearls and polish. "Alonzo, my friend," Norman said, shaking my hand like he was doing charity. "Heard you're adjusting to retirement. Must be a big shift. From the factory floor to quiet mornings, huh?" Factory floor. Not engineering. Not decades of innovation. Just floor. "It's been good," I said. "Congratulations on gaining such a brilliant daughter." "Oh, we're the lucky ones," Eleanor cooed. "She's such a gem, and with such a hard-working background, too. Hard-working. Like I was someone they hired to carry the flower arrangements." I looked at Georgiana, hoping for something, anything, but she beamed at them, her eyes filled with the kind of affection she used to give me. "Aren't they amazing, Dad?" she said, looping her arms through theirs. "They understand what family really means." She didn't look back as they walked toward the photographer's setup. I stood there, alone, watching her disappear between two people who'd known her for 2 years. I'd known her for 28, and for the first time that day, the envelope in my jacket didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a receipt for a transaction where I'd already been written off. The photography setup was near the altar, framed by towering arrangements of orchids and roses. A man in a tailored vest adjusted the lights and called out directions to the guests. "Immediate family only," he announced cheerfully, scanning the crowd through his camera lens. I straightened my suit jacket and took a slow breath. This was it, the moment I'd dreamed about. The father of the bride photo. The one that goes in the albums, the ones people hang on the walls, the kind of photo that survives generations. I took a step forward. "Actually," Georgiana's voice rang out loud and clear, "I need to clarify something." She turned toward me with a practiced smile that didn't match the chill in her eyes. "You're not part of the family photos, Dad. These are for immediate family only." The photographer paused mid-click. Guests nearby fell into a hushed silence. I froze, confused. "But I'm your father." She tilted her head slightly as if talking to a stubborn child. "You were. But this is my real family now." She gestured to the Hayes clan. Norman, Eleanor, Edwin, all of them assembling around her like she was royalty. The world spun. 28 years of parenthood collapsed in one sentence. Bedtime stories, scraped knees, tutoring through algebra, selling my tools to buy her first car. All of it reduced to a technicality. "Let's move him to the side," she told the photographer. "No anger, no venom. Just efficiency, like I was an object out of place, a prop being cleared from a stage." I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I just stepped back, my hands numb at my sides. I watched her pose between Norman and Eleanor, their designer outfits complementing hers perfectly. Norman placed a proud hand on her shoulder, the same shoulder I used to carry her on at the county fair. Eleanor leaned in like a mother who had raised her. And Georgiana. She smiled. The same smile she used to give me when I showed up to her plays. The same sparkle in her eye when I surprised her with ice cream after a tough test. Now, that light was pointed at people who'd known her a fraction of the time I had. People who couldn't tell you what she was afraid of as a child, or which lullaby she insisted on every night for 5 years. I stepped further back until I was in the shadows of a silk-draped column. A server passed by with champagne flutes, offering one with a polite smile. I took it, not to celebrate, but to give my hands something to do. Nearby, a woman I didn't recognize, one of the Hayes' friends, I guessed, leaned toward me and said, "Isn't it wonderful? Georgiana's so fortunate. This family really knows how to love." Fortunate. I smiled tightly and nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak, because in that moment I wasn't just excluded. I was erased. My $25,000 had paid for the venue, the photographer, the imported flowers, the catered meals. I'd signed every check, but they didn't include me in the family photo. I wasn't even asked to stand nearby. I was just the funding. A few feet away, Georgiana laughed at something Norman whispered. Her joy rang out like a bell, pure, light, genuine. She hadn't laughed like that with me in years, maybe not since high school. I had chalked it up to growing up, to moving on, to being busy. But now, seeing her surrounded by wealth and admiration, I realized it wasn't life that changed her. It was ambition. She wasn't just marrying into the Hayes family, she was becoming one of them. And in their world, people like me didn't exist. We were useful, disposable, replaceable. The champagne in my glass fizzed gently as I watched the man in the vest take picture after picture. Norman adjusting Georgiana's veil, Eleanor fixing a stray hair, Edwin whispering something in her ear while she blushed. My daughter, but not anymore. She had made her choice, and it didn't include the man who had sacrificed his life for hers. The envelope in my pocket felt heavier now, not like a gift, like evidence, and somewhere beneath the numbness something old and steady began to stir. Not anger, not spite. Resolve. I returned to my seat like a ghost. No one looked my way. No one noticed I hadn't been in the family photo. And if they did, no one said a word. The table I'd been assigned was in the corner near the restroom corridor. Probably not intentional, probably. A single place card with my name in neat, generic font. Alonzo Baker. Not father of the bride, just a guest. A guest who paid the bill. I sat down slowly, the cushion creaking under me like it was aware I didn't belong here. The sounds of laughter and music swirled through the grand ballroom. The orchestra was still playing. Servers glided between tables with trays of wine and hors d'oeuvres. Guests clinked glasses and complimented the decor. And me? I just sat there, hands folded, trying to breathe through a silence only I could hear. The envelope in my pocket had become a living thing. $25,000. 6 months of my life. A number that represented every overtime shift I'd picked up, every dinner I'd skipped, every moment I'd told myself, this will be worth it when she walks down the aisle. I pulled out my phone, my fingers stiff. The bank app opened with a fingerprint scan. There it was, a scheduled transfer set for 9:01 a.m. tomorrow morning. Labeled neatly, Riverfront Manor Wedding Deposit. 1 click would cancel it. Just one. But I didn't press it. Not yet. I stared at the screen until it dimmed and my own reflection stared back at me. Tired eyes, graying hair, the creases of years spent giving without asking for anything in return. The face of a man who thought love was loyalty, not currency. A man who had mistaken obedience for respect. "Are you okay, sir?" The voice startled me. A young server, maybe 20, hovered at my table. She had a kind face, the kind you don't see much in places like this. "I'm fine," I said, voice lower than I expected. "Just taking it all in." She nodded and moved on. leaving me alone with my thoughts. I watched her walk toward the kitchen doors. Her ponytail bounced as she moved. Someone else's daughter. Someone, I hoped, who would never grow up thinking money mattered more than memory. The reception picked up again. The photographer resumed clicking away. Norman gave a toast at the head table, raising his glass toward Georgiana with fatherly pride. Eleanor dabbed at her eyes as if she'd raised Georgiana herself. Edwin leaned over and whispered something in Georgiana's ear that made her laugh again. The bright, sparkling kind of laugh that once belonged to our living room during movie nights. I sipped my champagne. It tasted like vinegar. Every second of this celebration was a monument to sacrifice. My sacrifice. And yet, every face that turned to admire the flowers, the food, the lighting, none of them knew. None of them saw me. They saw the Hayes family, smiling in the center of it all like royalty. I was the architect of this castle, but I'd been locked outside the gates. And still I hadn't pressed the button. Still, I sat in silence, weighing the decision with the kind of care you reserve for something sacred. Because this wasn't about money. Not anymore. It was about identity. Was I still the man who gave without question? Who sacrificed with pride? Who let love mean laying down everything you had, even when it meant losing yourself? Or was I ready to become someone else? Someone who believed that love required respect, not just duty. The orchestra changed songs. A slow waltz started, echoing through the chandelier-lit room. And across the dance floor, Georgiana stepped into Norman's arms for the father-daughter dance. That was when I made the decision. I didn't cry, I didn't rage. I just reached into my jacket pocket, felt the edges of the envelope, and thought, this check doesn't make me her father, but tearing it up might make me a man again. And with that thought, the silence inside me turned to steel. The clinking of glasses died down as Eleanor rose from her seat, microphone in hand. The room hushed, all eyes turning toward her as she stood near the head table, her navy blue gown catching the golden glow of the chandeliers. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, voice smooth and practiced like she'd given speeches at countless fundraisers. "Thank you all for joining us to celebrate the union of two remarkable people. But before we move forward, I'd like to take a moment to speak about someone very special to us." I took a deep breath. Maybe, just maybe, this was the moment. Maybe Eleanor, for all her icy charm, would say something about me. A word of thanks. A nod to the man who'd made this celebration possible. Maybe she'd acknowledge the sacrifices it took to bring this day to life. She smiled warmly, but not at me. Her gaze swept across the room, settling on Georgiana with maternal affection. "Our daughter," she said with gentle emphasis. "Georgiana has brought so much light into our lives. From the moment Norman and I met her, she felt like one of our own." Applause, soft at first, then building. At first, people nodded, smiled, raised their glasses. I stared down at the champagne flute in front of me, unmoved. She is intelligent, graceful, and, as you can see, stunningly beautiful. But more than that, she's become part of a family who understands and cherishes her worth. I looked up, watching Eleanor pass the microphone to Georgiana, who rose with a grace that made the room collectively hold its breath. She looked radiant. She looked powerful. She looked rehearsed. Champagne flute in hand, Georgiana stepped forward and faced the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "This day has been a dream. Flawless, elegant, unforgettable. And it wouldn't have happened without the people who truly believe in me." She paused for dramatic effect, eyes scanning the crowd with quiet confidence. Then, she turned toward Norman and Eleanor. "Norman," she said, her voice softening, "you became the real father I needed." The room exhaled. I stopped breathing. "You showed me what unconditional love looks like. Not the kind tied to guilt or history, but the kind that builds you up and sees your potential. You taught me how to walk into a room with confidence, how to hold my head high, how to be proud of who I've become." People smiled. Some clapped. Norman beamed. I didn't move. "Unlike my biological father," she continued with a quick sip of champagne, "you didn't try to hold me back or remind me where I came from. You pushed me forward. You helped me rise." Laughter. Polite, understanding, sharp enough to cut skin. I stared at her, trying to reconcile this stranger in a wedding dress with the little girl who once clung to my leg because she was afraid of the dark. The girl who cried when I missed her first recital because of an emergency shift. The girl who made me promise, on the night of her 5th birthday, that I would never leave her like her mother did. And now, here she was, standing in front of 200 people, rewriting history in real time. Norman stood, took the microphone, and delivered the final blow. "My dear daughter," he said, "it has been my privilege to help guide you toward the life you were meant to have. Every parent wants their child to flourish, and it's clear you've found your place. I'm honored to call you my daughter." More applause. Eleanor joined him. "Welcome to our real family, darling." Real family. The phrase echoed inside me like thunder in a cathedral. I sat frozen, surrounded by clapping hands and smiling faces, strangers celebrating my erasure. My phone buzzed quietly. A final reminder from the bank. Scheduled payment of $25,000 will process tomorrow at 9 a.m. Right on cue. The check still sat in my jacket pocket, untouched, waiting. But now I didn't just reconsider. I knew. I stood silently, adjusted my tie, and slipped through the crowd. No one noticed. No one stopped me. Outside, the night air wrapped around me like a blanket dipped in reality. Cool, sharp, and sobering. Streetlights cast long shadows across the parking lot as I stood beneath them, the torn halves of the $25,000 check resting in my palms. I didn't feel anger. Not the explosive kind, anyway. What I felt was clean. Like something heavy had finally fallen off my shoulders after decades of wearing it like armor. I opened my wallet and pulled out a photo I'd kept tucked behind my license for years. Georgiana at 10 years old, toothless grin, braids, her arms wrapped tightly around my neck at the county fair, cotton candy stains on her cheek. That night she'd whispered, "Promise you'll never leave me like Mommy did." And I never did. I stayed through every scraped knee, every spelling bee, every heartbreak. I stayed when she failed her driver's test. I stayed when she got rejected from her first job out of college. I stayed when she called crying at midnight, wondering if she was good enough. I stayed long enough to become invisible. She didn't stop needing a father. She just started needing a different one. One that matched her new image. One with silk ties and country club connections. One who didn't smell like engine grease and stress. And tonight she let the world know I was no longer required. I folded the photo gently and slipped it back into my wallet. Not out of grief, out of closure. The little girl in that picture didn't exist anymore. She'd grown into a woman who chose status over substance, image over intimacy, and performance over parenthood. And that woman had made her decision, so I made mine. I placed one half of the torn check into my left pocket, the other half into my right. A symbolic divide. The point of no return. The silence in the parking lot felt different now, less lonely, more peaceful. I leaned against my old Ford, its metal cold against my back but familiar. Reliable. Real. Unlike the people still clinking glasses behind those ornate windows. They would learn soon enough. The invoice wouldn't be paid. The final check wouldn't arrive. Antonio would knock politely, then firmly, then with legal authority, and the glamorous illusion would crack under the weight of actual responsibility. Not out of spite, out of principle. Georgiana needed a lesson, not in etiquette or elegance, but in consequences. She said I wasn't her family anymore, so I believed her. I looked up at the stars, faint behind the city glow, and exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. For the first time, I wasn't trying to be someone else's rock. I was finally being my own. The grand doors of Riverfront Manor loomed ahead as I walked back up the steps. Inside, the celebration continued, music swelling, champagne flowing, and laughter echoing off marble floors like everything was perfect. But something had shifted. Not out there. In me. I pushed the door open and stepped back into the ballroom, now no longer as a father trying to be loved, but as a man who had finally remembered his own worth. The torn check rested in my pockets, one half in each, like quiet anchors. Symbols of everything I was letting go. No one noticed my return. And that was fine. Better, even. I passed tables filled with smiling guests. They complimented the wine, the floral arrangements, the music. Every detail praised, every cost forgotten. None of them knew the price, none of them knew who paid. At the center of it all, Georgiana stood with Edwin, glowing. Her white dress flowed like cream around her, as she spun in a dance choreographed by privilege. Norman and Eleanor sat at the head table sipping wine, proud like patrons admiring a statue they'd sponsored. "You know," I heard her say to her maid of honor, "Edwin really picked the most beautiful details, but technically Daddy paid for everything." Technically. That word bit harder than I expected, as if my sacrifice was just a logistical line item in the budget of her new life, a formality, something beneath mention. "Thank goodness for her father covering it all," Edwin said to Norman, clinking glasses. "Would have taken us years to afford this. It's good when simple people understand their place." Simple people. That was the word. Not generous, not devoted. Just simple. A man from the factory floor who knew his role: work, provide, disappear. I gripped my water glass, not out of anger, but to steady the wave of clarity washing over me. It wasn't just Georgiana who saw me as expendable. It was this entire room, built on the unspoken rule that people like me were useful only when needed. And now, I wasn't. "You must be proud," said a woman at a nearby table, smiling as she dabbed her lips with a cloth napkin. "What a beautiful wedding. What a generous gift." "Everyone gets exactly what they deserve," I replied quietly. She nodded with a cheerful misunderstanding and turned back to her meal. The orchestra played another waltz as couples swayed under the glow of chandeliers. Norman laughed at something Eleanor whispered. Edwin danced with Georgiana, their movements effortless and expensive. But time was ticking. I knew it. Antonio knew it. The bill would be delivered soon. And when it came, so would the truth. No speech, no confrontation, no drama yet. Just the calm before the storm. I returned to my table in the corner, still empty, still mine. I sat down, placed my napkin on my lap, and folded my hands. I wasn't angry. I was ready. For 28 years I had been the giver. Now I would be the mirror. And soon my daughter would see herself clearly for the very first time. The music dimmed slightly as dessert was served, sliced vanilla bean cake with gold-dusted frosting. Another line item on an invoice no one but me had read in detail. He placed the folder gently on the white linen tablecloth like it was a sacred text. I opened it. The numbers hadn't changed. I knew everyone by heart. Catering, $12,000 venue, $4,000 music, $4,000 photography, $2,000 floral arrangements, $3,000 total, $25,000. My sacrifice in black ink. "Of course," I said, closing the folder gently. "I'll let the bride know." Antonio nodded. "We appreciate your promptness. The kitchen is waiting on final payment before they can begin cleanup." His words were polite. His eyes were not. They knew this was just business, and business had timelines. I stood up and walked toward the head table, past guests still swirling wine in crystal glasses and laughing at the illusion of endless abundance. Georgiana saw me approaching and turned with a radiant smile. "Dad, there you are." She turned to Edwin. "Time to settle up." As casually as someone reminding the waiter to bring the check, she reached for a napkin to blot her lipstick and added, "Everything looks incredible, doesn't it? It really came together." I nodded. It did. That's why this next part is important. I held the leather folder up and placed it gently on the table in front of her. "The final invoice." Edwin peeked over her shoulder. "Oh, great, we'll get that wrapped up." Georgiana turned to me expectantly. "Well?" I smiled softly. "I've changed my mind." Her expression didn't register it at first. She blinked. "What?" "I won't be covering the payment." A pause. Laughter bubbled in her throat as if I were joking. "Dad, stop. This isn't the time for one of your lectures. This isn't a lecture. This is clarity." I folded my hands in front of me. "You made it clear today that I'm not your family anymore. Georgiana stood frozen, staring down at the leather folder like it was a trap she hadn't seen coming. Her cheeks, once perfectly flushed with bridal bliss, now blanched to the shade of her gown. Edwin leaned in close. "Open the gift envelopes. Start counting. Maybe there's enough in there." "What?" she hissed. "Just do it," he said. "Now." Together they moved, hurried, panicked, trying to stay composed as they reached the elegantly decorated gift table, the one with the hand-lettered sign that read, "With love and gratitude, Mr. and Mrs. Hayes." They began tearing into envelopes like looters after a storm. Nearby guests turned to watch, some in confusion, some in disbelief. "This one's from your college roommate," Edwin muttered, pulling out a few bills. $60. "Cousin Sarah, 150. Georgiana added, fingers trembling as she kept a mental tally. Their hands moved faster, stacking small bundles of cash beside empty envelopes. Cards tossed aside, ribbons unraveled, wrapping paper pushed off the table like clutter in a crisis. "Your boss gave you 200, Edwin mumbled. "Keep going," Georgiana whispered. "Faster." The bride and groom, centerpieces of an evening that was supposed to be flawless, now stood hunched over a table, faces tight with panic, reducing love letters and wedding wishes to raw currency. They looked like accountants in a disaster zone. "How much?" she asked, voice cracking. "Maybe 4,000, Edwin said, doing the math on his phone. 5 if we stretch it." "5?" she snapped. "We need 12 just for the catering." Antonio approached again, ever the professional. "Mrs. Hayes," he said softly but firmly, "we're still waiting on payment for the catering services. The kitchen staff cannot begin breakdown until accounts are settled." Georgiana tried to smile. It looked painful. "We're just, tallying up gift amounts. There's a bit of a mix-up with the primary payer." Antonio nodded. "Understood, but I'll need resolution within the next 30 minutes or we all have to escalate to collections protocol." "Collections?" she repeated, stunned. "At my wedding?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "We have policies." Policies, not pity, not negotiation, business. They turned back to the piles of bills, 20s, 50s, even the occasional 100. But it was a losing game. It wasn't enough. The reality of the situation finally started settling into Georgiana's carefully constructed facade. The dress, the diamonds, the designer heels, all of it was paid for by someone she had just disowned. And now, the man she'd replaced wasn't picking up the tab. She turned toward the head table, locking eyes with Norman and Eleanor. She moved quickly, dragging Edwin with her. "There's been a situation," she began, her tone a mix of panic and forced charm. "My father, Alonzo, has decided not to cover the final payment. It's just a silly misunderstanding, but we're short. Could you help us settle it? Just temporarily?" Norman didn't flinch. "Well," he said slowly, "we've already contributed quite a bit to your honeymoon arrangements, haven't we, dear?" Eleanor added gently. "And you are married adults now. We can't keep solving every little hiccup for you. That's not how real families operate." Georgiana's jaw fell slightly. "So, you won't help?" "We support you emotionally, darling," Eleanor said. "But financially? You'll have to manage your own commitments." Behind her, Edwin ran a hand down his face in disbelief. "You said this was handled," he muttered to Georgiana. "I thought it was," she snapped back. "He promised." And just like that, the Hayes' warmth turned cold. They looked away, dismissed her. The family she'd chosen, her real family, had stepped back at the first sign of inconvenience. The music kept playing. Servers kept serving. But now the celebration had a tremor beneath it. The cracks were forming, and everyone was watching. The illusion shattered with a single voice. Antonio, no longer patient, stepped into the center of the ballroom with his clipboard and microphone in hand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began with the poise of a seasoned professional. "Apologies for the interruption, but I must address an urgent financial matter before we can continue the evening's festivities." The orchestra stopped mid-song. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations froze mid-laugh. Antonio continued, his voice steady. The outstanding balance for tonight's catering services, totaling $12,000, remains unpaid. If this matter is not resolved within 10 minutes, I will be contacting our contracted security provider to begin debt recovery procedures. You could feel the temperature drop 10 degrees. Whispers rippled across the tables. Guests turned toward the head table, then to Georgiana and Edwin, who stood rooted beside the now ransacked gift table, cheeks flushed with panic and embarrassment. Georgiana's face crumpled. She turned toward me, toward the corner table where I sat quietly sipping my water. Her voice trembled and cracked as she shouted across the ballroom, loud enough for every single guest to hear. "Dad, you're destroying me." The entire room turned. "You're ruining the most important day of my life," she cried, eyes wild, mascara starting to streak. "You said you would take care of everything. You promised. What kind of father humiliates his daughter like this?" There it was, the tantrum, fully bloomed. Not a bride, a child, a woman screaming not because she was hurt but because the world had finally stopped bending to her will. I stood up slowly and adjusted my tie. Calm. Controlled. My voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. "You made it clear I'm not your family anymore," I said, loud enough to carry. "So I'm honoring your wishes. Your real family can pay your real bills." Her mouth opened, then closed. Her arms hung limp at her sides. The silk of her gown shimmered in the light, but her posture had collapsed. Someone gasped. Edwin stepped forward, panicked. "Sir, please. We didn't mean any disrespect. Surely we can come to some sort of arrangement?" I looked him dead in the eye. "You were fine watching me get sidelined, watching my daughter erase me. You said nothing. You toasted to it." He looked away. Georgiana's hands balled into fists. "This isn't fair. You can't just abandon me like this." "I didn't abandon you," I said, voice low and firm. "You fired me. I'm just clocking out." Antonio, still holding the mic, cleared his throat. 5 minutes remaining before we escalate to recovery protocol." A chill went through the room. Guests started looking for exits, unsure whether this would end in tears or a scene worthy of the local news. Georgiana turned back to Norman and Eleanor, but they were already standing, quietly excusing themselves from the head table, leaving their champagne glasses behind like a battlefield surrender. They didn't meet her eyes. They didn't offer help. They just walked. She looked around wildly, but there was no one left. She was alone. In a room filled with 200 people, she stood exposed. No love, no support, just bills, broken promises, and the bitter taste of consequences. I watched it all from my table, the one farthest from the cake, the one that was never meant to matter, and I felt nothing. No revenge, no triumph, just justice. Georgiana's voice, once polished and poised, now cracked in desperation. "Please, someone, just help us settle this. We can figure out the rest later." But no one moved. Not Norman, not Eleanor, not Edwin's friends, not the co-workers who once toasted her rise through the corporate world. Everyone sat frozen, eyes flicking down to their plates, phones, or drinks, anywhere but at the bride crumbling in front of them. The music had stopped completely. The atmosphere, once filled with laughter and violins, was now choked with tension. Even the servers stood still at the edges of the room, unsure if they should keep working or get out of the blast radius. Georgiana stumbled toward me again, mascara smudged, her expression collapsing into panic. "Dad, please." "I take it back. I was wrong. You're my real father. You always have been. Just help me, please." But the words came too late. I stood slowly, carefully, not out of anger, but as if rising from a burden I no longer carried. "You said it yourself," I replied calmly. "I'm not your family. You can't unring that bell just because the bill came due." Tears streamed down her cheeks, her voice barely above a whisper now. "I didn't mean it like that. I was trying to fit in, be who they needed me to be. And in doing that," I said, "you forgot who raised you, who made this day possible. You erased me to impress people who couldn't even lend you $12,000 when it mattered. The silence in the room was deafening. There was no sympathy left to give her, only the quiet recognition of someone who had burned the wrong bridge. She turned back to Edwin, who stood paralyzed beside the pile of half-opened envelopes. "Do something," she hissed. He didn't move. He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time and realizing he didn't like what he saw. Antonio stepped forward again, voice firm. "Mrs. Hayes, we are out of time." Georgiana turned to the crowd, her voice rising in hysterical desperation. "Someone help, I can't, this can't happen, this is my wedding." A murmur swept the crowd, but still no one stood. Not one guest. And that's when it happened, the true collapse. Her shoulders slumped, her makeup streaked, her voice gave out. She sank slowly into the chair beside the gift table, surrounded by crumpled bills and discarded cards, the remnants of a dream she'd built without a foundation. Everything she thought she could rely on, status, appearance, approval, vanished. And all that was left was truth. I picked up my jacket from the back of my chair and took one last look at her. Not with hatred, not even with pity, but with clarity. She had chosen this. She had written the story. I simply stopped funding the fantasy, and in the end, that was all it took for the entire world she built to fall. That night I didn't just walk away from a wedding. I walked away from decades of being taken for granted. My daughter chose appearances over loyalty, status over love, and in the end, she was left with nothing but silence and unpaid bills. I didn't seek revenge, I gave a lesson. One she'll remember every time she looks at those photos without me in them. For the first time in years, I chose myself, and that felt like peace. If this story hit home, like the video, subscribe for more powerful tales and drop a comment. What would you have done in his shoes?